You're very, very welcome back again, and thank you for coming back. That's the first good sign. So now you've seen what our students have done. You've seen what they've been up to. And what we wanted was to have, we're calling it a conversation with a purpose. So this is a conversation between international recruiters, the people on both sides, as we send out our students and receive our students, and the people who send us students and take our students. And also between academics and between the community. So you've seen the students. This is the team behind the projects. And if I could introduce, all of these people are involved. Professor Shane Kilcummins is the head of the School of Law. So if you were looking at the 7 law projects, this is the head of that team. This is Dr. Mairead Moriarty, who's our Assistant Dean of Affairs International. So Mairead, as well as being a language specialist in linguistics, and as well as taking the practicum that some of you may have seen in Texel with her students that were teaching refugees and asylum seekers, in her spare time she's also promoting the university internationally. To her right is John Rail, who's a youth worker. Is only the beginning of the description of what John does. He's a collaborator, a professor of creativity, we might call him, for all kinds of wonderful things you can do with young people. And I've worked with him a great deal in our projects in the Department of Politics and in other projects with Limerick Youth Services. And Limerick Youth Services are really the best thing about Limerick City. They're inclusive, they're creative, and John would be one of the best things about Limerick Youth Services. To my right is Eric Leinan, whom I also have the pleasure of working with. Eric is the Director for Global Programs and Strategy Alliance at the University of Minnesota. So Eric is one of the angels I referred to earlier, who is behind the scenes. He sends out students. He's responsible for the programs they take and for liaising with our university, and also for ensuring that they're doing well while they're here. And he works very closely, of course, with Catherine Martin, who is also at the University of Limerick. And Catherine is the manager of our study abroad in the Americas, so they work closely together. And between us all, we have managed a conversation. We all had things we wanted to say, and we have a slightly planned conversation here where we all managed to say what we wanted to say in a conversational style. So after they had told me, this is what I really need to tell the people, I have devised a question that will allow them to elicit the answer. So it's a small bit sneaky, but it does enable you to get the views from a lot of people in a short space of time, and you can ask the questions that you like at the end, and it's a bit nicer than having PowerPoints and 15-minute presentations and so on. So looking at the projects that many of you have seen and looking at the community-engaged learning, there's an awful lot of talk, which you're all familiar with, about the additional value of community-engaged learning for the development of transferable skills. Sometimes I call generic skills, sometimes I call soft skills. In our university, they're the graduate attributes. But we're talking about those real-life skills. And what I wanted to ask is this really the case? In your experience, does community-engaged learning really deliver those kinds of extra skills? Catherine.
Oh, great. I'm first up. Yes, is the short answer. We know from speaking to my partners in the States, going to conferences, speaking to students and speaking to you guys, that for today's students, they're very much focused on their career. The previous generation of the millennials were more interested in kind of creativity and big world and kind of having exciting careers in New York or wherever. This generation realised that there isn't a lot of money, that the financial state of the world is precarious, and they're looking for careers early in college that they can progress towards. The practicum, or community engagement, gives a practical element for that student. So yes, it is giving something back to the community, but it's also very much focused on this will be good for my career and my CV. And actually, coincidentally, one of the students just said it to me outside the door. She said, I can't do this in my home university, and this should be in every university. And she said, it's really going to be great for my career. And I said, well, that's great, but remember, it's not all about your career. It's about what you're doing. But yes, you can utilize this in your interviews to say that you've worked immersively with real people in a real community, in a real life setting, and what you've learned from that. So the skills, the skill set, the projects that they're working on will all work for them. Okay, my 3 minutes are up.
So I want to say, is that true, Eric? Is that what you find on the other side of the Atlantic? Do they really get the skills? Do they move on?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to provide a little bit more background on what Maura mentioned, so I work at the University of Minnesota in the Learning Abroad Center, and we are partners with the University of Limerick. We send probably 30 students a year here between the fall and the spring semesters, and roughly 1/4 of those students end up participating in the UL Practicum. So if you hit all of the tables out there just now, you would have spoken to 6 students from the University of Minnesota, and that's not even all of them who participated in the practicum this semester. I think there were 1 or 2 who didn't make it today. So we really try and promote it to our students. We know that they're not all going to participate, but we really do. And part of it is because of the career skills that they get out of it. And having that event right before this one was a perfect reminder, because in talking to the 6 different University of Minnesota students who were up there, I heard things like event planning, strategic planning, looking at needs and identifying ways to meet those needs, setting goals and outcomes for group-based projects. And I talked to an industrial engineer, I talked to an accountant, I talked to a psychology major, and no matter what intended career path they have, those are all skills that are going to fit into that. And at the University of Minnesota, our biggest college is the College of Liberal Arts. 15,000 out of our 50,000 are in that college, and that college is becoming much more intentional about promoting itself for career skills. Students see the value of an engineering degree, they see the value of a business degree, but they don't always see the value of a history degree or a poli-sci degree. And so the College of Liberal Arts is really looking for ways that students can get those practice-based career skills in not necessarily a traditional internship setting. And so programs like the UL Practicum provide those. And so we're looking at all of our partners around the world to try and find more programs exactly like this one.
Well, that's just beautiful, because I have here 2 colleagues from the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences who might talk to you about the skills that they get. Shane or Mairead, who wants to go first?
I'll go first, in that I want to pick up on the point you made about liberal arts, and I would really consider myself as an advocate for the humanities. So in this age of STEM, the humanities and the skills that you get from not just a humanities or a liberal arts degree, but also by being involved in these projects, are somewhat forgotten, but they are probably the most valuable skills that graduates take with them. So dependent on, or doesn't matter what degree path you're taking in science or maths or arts or medicine or whatever it is, you need a core set of soft skills. You need to have empathy. You need to have an ability to be critical without being patronizing. And you only learn that by being involved in these types of projects. So, lecturers and modules can stand up and teach these skills and give, fantastic PowerPoint presentations on these skills. But it's only in the real world enactment of these types of projects that students truly gain the types of soft skills that are most needed in this time of mobility, forced, unforced mobility. We have to have empathy and understanding and an ability to deal with all sectors of the society in an empathetic way.
Now, Shane, what can you add to that?
I should have gone first. So I came here to UL 4 years ago, and most of my lecturing up to that point had been talk and chalk as a lawyer, just setting out the rules and so on for students. And there was a module on one of our degree programs called Advanced Lawyering, which allowed this opportunity to engage with stakeholders in the local community. I thought it was fascinating. And so the Inspector of Prisons approached me and asked me, we need to create a database for deaths in custody. We have no money, can you help? And so for the first time became involved in this. And we actually, we did some research with the students. We involved 10 students. So we asked them about what they were learning, and we kind of conducted interviews with them at three points through the process. And so one of the things they talked about was leadership and management skills, about if you're managing a report, how to do so in an effective way when there's an outcome required. They talked about teamwork. They had to collaborate as a team to have a set of recommendations that they all agreed upon. They talked about the importance of public speaking. They had to meet the Inspector of Prisons, justify what they'd done. how they'd done it. Tolerance of others. So when you're in a group, when you're doing research by committee, or you're trying to produce a report by committee, you are going to have to persuade, to engage, all of those types of skills. They talked about time management, and they talked about research. And what I think was really interesting about this is that a practicum directs students away from familiar and settled patterns of learning. So normally what happens is, if I'm teaching students law, you sit and listen, and I'm there talking, and you can ask questions, but it's kind of, you take it down, and what's come up in the exam, and you move on. Whereas with this practicum, it really promoted deep learning, and we can talk about pedagogy later, but it was this idea about we have to justify these findings. It's not per se about a mark, it's about is this the best possible database it could be? And I thought that was really good. It also helped them think like lawyers. They talk about thinking like a lawyer, so for the first time as they went through their degree, now they could see the value of what they were doing, and they could see that there was a purpose to this, and so it made them think like lawyers, which obviously is a good thing. It had a strong synthesizing impulse, so it pulled their entire degree together. And even though it was on a particular area, they could now see all the skills that the incremental skills they developed and the knowledge that they developed through the program. And I think the last thing, and I'm done, I've obviously gone over the 3 minutes, but I think the key for me in listening to the students was this idea of transition. And so, universities, very often from a legal perspective, is about paper rules. But now what they were doing is through this practicum, they were transitioning into the real world of work. And they were seeing this as a practical value afterwards. Everything you do here in terms of this project has a strong public service value. And I think it did help them transition. So.
Well, that's interesting there that you're talking about deep learning and pedagogy. So what is this deep learning that you're talking about? What kind of it? Is it a different sort of pedagogy, a different way of teaching?
Yeah, I don't see it in terms of a science, but I think because I don't know enough about it, but I think that from a deep learning, what the students come back with in the interviews with them was that they felt ownership of this service learning, that they owned it. It was important that they provide the recommendations. And so when you have, I think the contrast between that ownership and what normally happens in a lecture theatre is that you just feel part of a group and everybody does this and you can stay quiet, you can kind of hide behind it and you just do your exam and it's over. Whereas with this, the Inspector of Prisons wants to know what's the database. He has to justify it to the Department of Justice. So there's a real ownership. And so now when you're researching with an end goal in mind. It's not just about a mark, it's about a recommendation. And so I think it brings that kind of real life world experience into the classroom. So I think that's the deep learning that I'm referring to on that.
And I see John nodding, and John hasn't had a chance to say anything, so...
Well, I agree with the transition into the real world thing, and I suppose to provide a tiny bit of context, because I'm up here, I guess, coming from a community background, a community work background. I work with young people up to the age of 30, and traditionally, I suppose youth work was seen as being up to the age of 15, 16, and it was kind of saying in this pastoral sense of you give the young fella a ball and leave him out in the field and somebody supervises him. And yeah, up until maybe the 50s and 60s that was the case, but actually in the EU you're a young person up until the age of 30 now, so just to let some people know here.
You're still young.
Yeah, and in China it's 40, so you're too. But it's this transition, and it's bringing the idea of like divergent thinking into how people learn. And I myself would have worked with Maura on this project called Limerick Be Heard through UL Engage. And that started with the idea of these young people that were coming towards finishing secondary school. Some of them didn't know whether they wanted to go to university. Some of them were scared that they wouldn't get into university, and some of them didn't know whether it was for them. And we sat down, because they were very interested in, passionate about community development, passionate about politics in the wider sense of the word, and, passionate about empowerment of young people. And what they felt was that their peers, a lot of them didn't feel the same, and at times they didn't feel the same. And that kind of disempowerment led them to feel that maybe, I won't be going to university because I don't know if I have the intelligence to last 4 years. And what they got from kind of a different way of approaching learning, which was, I sat down with Maura, we said, what kind of evidence base can you offer for group work, sitting around in circles, working in a kind of a restorative way through issues, and goal setting. So they came up with a program, like a 6-week program, where it was about empowering young people's voice and their influence, and about people discussing things that maybe they weren't asked about before, and seeing things in a different way. And then Maura and I were like, how can we bring this to the university and have it as part of the practicum, and work with really disadvantaged young people. And just to add some context there, some of the young people I work with would be really disillusioned with education in general. They would have left mainline education and would be engaged maybe in a training course or a small level FETAC course, or the LCA. And in their mindset, their value is that. That's how they see it. And they see politicians as old men in grey suits, and they see the university as this other building. But through the practicum that they did, the practicum was bringing second-year students from UL, from the politics and public admin, out to Limerick Youth Service for 6 weeks. They looked like deers in the headlight the first day they were there. And they met these young people who they are difficult. They're difficult to work with. There's no painting over that. But they do work. And if you work with them on their level, in their setting, I think the benefit goes both ways. I think those students came back, and even talking to them outside, they learned a lot more about Limerick. In particular, there was one student from America that had a completely different idea about the city, because she'd only been out here in the university, and she met real Limerick people from real parts of Limerick who talked about the issues from their perspectives, like the huge national issues at the moment. I won't mention the war. But they talked about that, and they saw it from different socioeconomic backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. So one young person that was on that 6-week program was a young traveller, and he really was interested in going to university, but didn't know anyone from university, had seen them on the telly, had seen the people coming on that had degrees. And when people that were, coming in to talk to him, I'm really going over my 3 minutes or so. When these students came in to talk to him, he was like, Joe, these people aren't that much different to me. I might have a value system or a different viewpoint, and I can teach them about my world, and they can teach me about theirs, and together we can learn. And the one very practical thing that's after happened is a lot of those young people were 18 and they weren't voting. They weren't going to vote in the upcoming referendum. And we just yesterday, because I knew I was doing this today, I just popped into one of the classes and just asked how many of them were registered to vote. And they weren't all. That would be beautiful. Imagine they were all registered to vote. But at least 50% of that class had registered to vote, whereas 6 weeks ago, they hadn't. They knew they had to, because just through group work and conversation, not being told, you have to vote. They said, well, I have a voice, I have a reason, and I learned that through working with the University of Limerick.
So, immersive. Do you have something to say about immersive learning?
Well, I think Shane said, or everybody's actually said the same thing, which is good. We're all on the same page. I think for a lot of the visiting students, the Erasmus study abroad exchange students, they self-select the practicum. So when they come at an orientation, we invite Maura and Bernie to come along, and Tracy to talk to the students. And this is often their first time of actually hearing about the module. But when they come to do it, they do it for many reasons. Some of them, as I said, it's for the academic credit, it might be for the career, it might be just of an interest, it might want to just go and see a little more of the city. But it is very immersive, and as Shane said, I think the key word is ownership. So it's not somebody standing like here lecturing somebody, which we know isn't the most effective form of teaching, really. I don't know if it ever has been, but certainly not today. And today's students don't want to be taught that way. So they learn by doing. And by having ownership and deciding what they want to do and how they want to do it, they're invested. So if they're invested, they're interested. So yes, they're self-selecting it, but it's not the same as self-selecting one of their academic modules, even though this is for credit. But it's truly immersive, and they learn. So they're learning as they go. So I'm really only echoing what's already been said on the panel.
So there's a lot of talk about deep learning, differentiated learning, immersive learning. And I can see the benefits. I guess we can see the benefits. But do international students, so do our visiting students, do they get any extra, or do they get the same? Is it as good for them, as it were, as it is for everyone else? Mairead, you're Assistant Dean for International Affairs. What's your experience?
I think the key benefit is probably the learning payoff in terms of intercultural and global competence. And that benefits everybody, so a local domestic Irish student and an international student. So as most of us, I'm sure, in the room are aware, from 2018, PISA are going to start judging every education system based on their ability to develop global competence. And the universities have a really, really strong role to play in that. So not only do we have to teach our current students how to be global citizens, but we also have to teach them how to teach primary school and high school students types of global competence. And really what you see from interaction in UL Engage modules is students begin to learn how to behave cross-culturally. So they learn how to overcome barriers that are entirely cultural or linguistic dependent. So they learn how to overcome issues to do with time. They would learn how to do with issues around maybe a Chinese student who is a participant in the UL Engage project not being familiar with some of the social networking sites that they might like to use. And they begin to gain an understanding of what it is truly like to act as an intercultural being. And you can't learn that in a classroom. You have to learn that from trial and error. You have to learn that from mistakes, from arguments that they may have in their groups in the context of their modules, but they overcome them. And at the end, particularly in the UL Engage module that I manage, what I find from the participants is that they understand what it means to act interculturally. So they understand that actually intercultural studies is not about acculturation. And in a way, the English-speaking world is kind of guilty of expecting everybody to acculturate to English-speaking norms. And they realize, actually, I have to bend. I, too, have to learn, irrespective of my cultural or my linguistic background, I have to learn also how to be a global citizen and an intercultural citizen. And that will take them into the workplace with a unique set of skills.
And Eric, you had some comments about the learning that your students have when they come to host cultures.
Right. And particularly when our students come to Ireland. In the US, I think we often have a very romanticized notion of Ireland. A lot of students come here thinking...
And get disappointed.
Ireland is leprechauns and Guinness and shamrocks, and they forget that there are actual people living here who have very real challenges and very real feelings and beliefs as well. And we also know that when our students come to Ireland, they spend a lot of their time traveling when they're not in class. And so if a student is coming and they have this romantic notion of Ireland and they spend all their time viewing all of the beauty that is in this country, they might not get that other piece. As you were saying, that student who spent all her time here on campus didn't really get into the community and didn't really realize some of the issues that are out there. So that's why we like programs like the UL Practicum, is because it gives our students that other bit. And one other thing that I kind of just noticed this morning is that, so with the Practicum, they're learning outside of the classroom, they're learning from the community that they're engaging with, but a lot of the teams that we met upstairs were made up of students from the US and from Europe and from Asia, and local students as well. So you're adding yet another layer of cross-cultural dynamic to these individual teams made up of people from all over the world working with a local community here in Ireland. So it does really add another element to students' education here in Ireland. We know they always come and they like to take classes on Irish history,
culture,
Irish politics, and it's great to get that in the classroom, but then when they go out into the community and they see how those things affect real people, it adds just another dimension that...
And yeah, I think it's very important as well for like a lot of the study abroad and the exchange students and the Erasmus to a degree as well. It's a 15-week, I think they think the semester is going to be like 15 years. It's 15 weeks, and by the time you come and get settled, half the semester is over, and a lot of the American students travel to Europe every other weekend, or they'll go around Ireland with their clubs and societies. They don't, and you've seen what a fantastic campus we have here. It's like a village, it is a village. So you need to physically pick yourself up and bring yourself into the city. Oftentimes Limerick is overlooked because they're going to Dublin, they're going to London, they're going to Barcelona, they're going to Belfast, they're going to the Cliffs of Moher, you know, so it's like, what about going into the city? So the practicum, UL Engage, is a really good way of and our domestic students, so the Irish students don't always go into the city. They live on campus and then they go home to Tipperary or Clare, wherever they're from. So the engaging with the community is a really important way for these students to get out there and see real people doing real things with their real lives. And especially for the American students, the European students probably don't go home every weekend. One assumes they do stay around. But the American students tend to have like an itinerary. So we're trying to balance the academic and their tourism, but also their culture. And you can learn about Irish folklore, Irish history, or Irish literature in your class, but really to actually see real Irish people engaging with them is fantastic, and that's really what we're about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think anyway. But we need to make it happen,
So,
which is what UL Engage is about.
so what's the impact then? What does that do, John? You've had a few experiences with our international students.
I guess the idea of like reflective learning is the big thing there, and what I found a beautiful thing that would happen is when the international students came in to meet the groups afterwards. Initially, I'd sat down with them and we had like a group chat about what worked, what didn't work, and like it's goal setting and discussing the actual humans that they were working with, not the idea or like just the theory. They were discussing like how practically what they were learning in university could be related to how they were going to work with these young people. And let me just highlight again, some very difficult young people. but like they accepted the challenge, and they knew that they were either going to sink or swim with this. There was these 12 students in a room. They had to work it out themselves. Obviously, they had my support and they had your own great support. But it was very much on them. And they couldn't just be, I suppose, passengers in their own education. They had to be participants, and that goes for the group as well, the young people as well. Because it would be great, like from an outer perspective, you could say, the students came in and taught them stuff, but the students probably learned more from working.
There's a lovely example. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk. It's my conversation. I can have something. But when we were working together, one of the things we did, we ended up in. It was lovely. We ended up in Cape Town at a summer school with a group of our students, and one of the students from Cape Town, well, the young people, they weren't in a university, was asking about what's happening in Ireland with the abortion referendum. Don't mention the referendum. And it was really, really interesting because one of the discussions that John and I have routinely is that young people nowadays, in their sort of Facebook silos and echo chambers, they only ever talk to people who agree with them, or they only receive the news from people that think like they do. And actually the knack of talking to people who are different to you is something I fear that students are losing, which obviously as a politics lecturer is appalling, because that's how we maintain democracy. And what was really interesting when our students from Ireland and our young people met with people from another country, and when somebody from another country said, "So explain this to me about abortion," whereas if somebody else in their own peer group, in their own peer country, they could have dismissed them, they could have just not answered them, or they could have not dealt with that. They had a responsibility because this was somebody they were visiting from another country, and they had to sort of explain what this is about. They had to explain both sides, and they had to articulate what was going on in a way that they're not pushed to do when they're just amongst their own peer group who all think the same or who agree. So they actually, I found completely unexpected, was that they began to articulate things from home, but that only happened and that only surfaced when they spoke to people from somewhere else. And that happens again, as Eric was saying, in the teams that we have, where we have students from different places working together. They end up sort of seeing their own domestic puzzles, problems, issues from a completely different perspective when they talk to a student from somewhere else.
And that just came up when talking to a couple of the students from Minnesota, saying that they got some questions about our president, and they got kind of used to it when it's coming from another student, and they knew how to talk about it. But when it came from the community members, it kind of forced them to rethink their responses to things like that. And so, I totally agree.
I think the South Africans, when we were over there, what the good thing was, the young people we brought over, I'd seen them answer questions in Ireland, and they could kind of gloss over stuff, and they could they basically had to do a basic Irish history lesson about where we were, what the state was like this, and the people that were listening to them had no kind of bias either way, because they weren't familiar with anything from Ireland. They knew nothing about Ireland. All they knew about was shamrocks, shillelaghs, and pints of Guinness. And they were their social issues, they had a myriad of them. They had so many social issues, but we obviously had social issues as well. And I guess that our young people learned that, our lot in life is always in flux and change, and you need to be able to explain things and be challenged on things and discuss things. But equally, the Cape Town group learned the same, that their values needed to be changed and challenged, and that they couldn't just get upset if somebody disagreed with them, that they needed to, discuss things and realise that there's different views and everything, and that's what makes the world go round.
So, all this wonderful student experience, I'm inclined to ask, what's the value of that for everybody else? It's great for us. What's the public value of that? Because Shane, you're very concerned about the public value we offer.
Yeah, it was something that came out of the project as well. I mean, I think it's very often with practicums, it's public service learning. And I feel strongly that, I work in a public university and that it should have value. But I know that, for example, if that report had been commissioned by the Inspection of Prisons, if it had been commissioned by a private consultant, it would have probably cost about €20,000, and it wouldn't have been as good. Because very often with those types of reports, they'll tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell a government department what they want to hear, whereas this can be done, it doesn't cost any money, there's no conflict of interest, and you can tell it as it is. And so I think that's excellent to begin with, that there is a real public value there to the taxpayer, but also to the stakeholders, that there are lots of ways in which universities can help, and particularly local stakeholders, right across all sorts of areas. And I think that, so ensuring, as Seamus Heaney talked about, the gates being unbarred, that's crucial. And I think that, but I think it's wonderful that then staff can engage. And there is a lot of work in setting up a practicum. There's a lot of logistics, maintaining relationships with stakeholders and so on. So I think that the staff who do engage in it deserve, real praise for it, because it is a lot of work. But I do think that apart from the benefits from us, there's also excellent benefits for service providers. So, yeah.
And Mairead, you wanted to talk about the opportunities. You were talking not so much about the buck saving, but the social empowerment.
I think so specifically the UL Engage module that I run is for students who are training to be English language teachers, design and deliver courses in English to refugees and asylum seekers. And how we do that is we actually interview and do needs analysis with the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. So instead of relying on government initiatives that tell us the type of English the government thinks they need, we actually go directly to the refugees and asylum seekers and ask them, what are the gaps in the English language provision that you're getting from the state that we can fill? And from that, we design and deliver 3 separate courses. So the current course will finish today, and we'll have a graduation ceremony for all of the participants this afternoon. But for me, the major learning payoff is empowerment. So it's empowerment on the 2 sides. Most importantly for me, particularly in my other hat, is as chair of the University's Sanctuary Committee, which is all about access to university for refugees and asylum seekers. And I do a lot of local kind of voluntary work with refugee and asylum seeking groups. And empowering refugees to have the decision and to have input into the courses that they receive is hugely beneficial to them. And that is evident in the fact that they stick with the courses, they come weekly. The numbers have grown exponentially over the 2 years that we have run the courses because they feel an immediate learning payoff for them. Equally, for our own students, our own MA students who deliver these courses, we train them to be English language teachers in a very privileged way. So they do a lot of their teaching practice with the Erasmus students, who are predominantly European students who have competed in the first instance to be an Erasmus student here. They're highly motivated about their English, about improving their English. They come at really good literacy levels. We are giving them textbooks to teach, and that in a way is good practice for the students. But I kind of feel that we need to strip away all of those privileges and put them into an environment where within the one classroom, they have students who are completely illiterate, right up to students who are very advanced in English. And that is the real world of English language teaching. The real world is, in a university setting, is only for the privileged few English language teachers who end up in language centres and universities. The majority spend their time teaching English in developing countries, where the reality is that their only resource is themselves as teacher. And that is very empowering for our students, where we say, take away all those aids, take away all those crutches that you're relying on, take away PowerPoint, take away textbooks. Focus on you the teacher, and how you can deliver very effective courses to these groups. So I really see an empowerment, both from the community with whom we work. They're deciding what we teach them, how we teach them, what it is they need in order to integrate into the society. And then the students are learning to rely on themselves as a teacher, to take away all of those kind of lovely crutches that we have, and to realize that all they need is actually themselves in the classroom. So from both points of view, there is a huge level of empowerment.
I just want to check, does this ring true? You are the community person here, John.
Yeah.
So, would you agree with that, or?
I think I agree with everything there. So
Yes.
it's going to be hard to follow that. But I suppose just offer context again, like with the work UL Engage has done with Limerick Youth Service, the kind of beautiful thing is that there's potential for more. Traditionally, any other bodies we'd have worked with, it'll have a beginning, middle, and end, and then there's a lovely ceremony and everyone goes away, and then there's nothing happens. But what was nice was after we finished the kind of first phase in 2016, there was a tenacity almost for like what are we going to do from here, and how can we get more into the community. And like Limerick, in Limerick specific, Limerick Youth Service is like the oldest youth service in Ireland, and it's got the largest kind of cross section of hubs. So it really is in the community. It has you can give it that much, and it works with young people and adults from all different backgrounds and new communities as well. So I think the potential for collaboration there is endless. We get as much from UL as we give them as well. So there's times where I get asked by my manager going, they're doing a lot for us, Like, yeah, we're doing a lot for them as well. You know? So I think there's a beauty to that, and I certainly love doing it. And I guess I'd like that maybe when there's something like this in a few years' time again, that there's one of my colleagues sitting here that's been involved in it as well, that it has a kind of a multiplier effect, you know, that there's more involvement from the community sector with the University of Limerick.
So I thought maybe in the last few minutes you might have a few questions, or?
I realized that there was not that much Irish native students involved in the community project. Is there a real? Do you have any number or percentage of
I can answer
strange
that question.
students and native one?
I can answer that question. So there are two answers. First is that we primarily got the international students here for this international forum. And there are actually other students that weren't here. And the second part of the answer is that this is week 14. Our Irish students are doing their exams this week. So we could arrange the poster presentation in the gap when staff are available, but the students are largely in their exams. But practicums would run across all of our students. Yeah. So they would be Irish and international students. So in the project, for example, that Eric's students are involved in from Minnesota, they typically are the only person from the States in a group.
Yeah.
That's more normal. We're perhaps giving a slightly different view of it today by virtue of the students that came.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, before the projects were set up, were there challenges that you came across in getting organisations involved? You know, obviously you have to go to them and say, it's a great idea that you'll take these students, they're going to do this and they're going to do that, but were they ever hesitant maybe to take students or to see the value of it before?
I was going to say, I'll let Shane give an answer as well, because I know that the lawyers often look for people. From my own perspective, I've never worked with anybody that hasn't already asked for my help. So I don't go looking for people because from my own discipline, I'd have a disciplinary ethic that actually, as a person in the university, I shouldn't be going out telling people, you know what you need. That's counter to my notion of community work. But there is, if you do it once, as John says, once you do something once with one group, you won't be short of people asking you to do something again. And there is a sort of a mushrooming effect. But some of our other colleagues actually do, I mean, particularly with law projects and maybe with the language projects, you are looking for a group to work with. And there has to be, if you like, a first time. So I'll let you answer. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have to have the modules so that you can engage. And then there is a challenge initially, sometimes finding a stakeholder who will come on board with it. I think I can genuinely say that once the stakeholder does come on board, it's always a good experience because of the public value that's been given back. Sometimes actually the bigger challenge is fitting it into an academic schedule. So let's say the Rape Crisis Network comes to us and says to us, can you do and they have done this, can we do a frequently asked questions? Can you provide the answers for us? But we have to link it in with our academic timetable for students to be able to do it. So that can be a challenge as well. But I think all of these hurdles can be overcome through conversations and so on. So, well, we can do it in this period of time and this is how it'll look and so on. I think particularly when stakeholders can see what the benefits they're going to get through it, I think it does work. But undoubtedly there are challenges. And it does require as well, it does require staff, academic staff in particular, who are going to lead these practicums. They also need to be aware of the opportunities and they need to be engaging with stakeholders who can actually provide the actual practicum there.
And that's also one of the roles that UL Engage plays. Because you are asking a lot of academic staff. It's very rewarding, but most rewarding things are, quite hard. And there's a lot of setup. So one of the purposes of UL Engage is to make that setup simpler, so that we have a sort of a set of, if you like, templates. That if you go to a community meeting, we've got the feedback forms, because it's good practice to ask people, how was that? How could I develop it? If you develop community briefings, so some of the law projects have done fabulous work and have produced reports, and we provide the template so that a staff member who's looking at setting up something a little bit alternative, they do have the resources there to help them with community briefings, with research reports, with feedback forms, all those kind of extra things that you'd be thinking, how do I print this? Where do I go? Have I got a... so those are the kinds of things that we can support them with. And also the very, very important things like teas and coffees, because generally speaking, in a project like this, a community has something they'd like to do, and they're willing to offer their time because there's an obvious payback. An academic staff member has the expertise and they'd like to do it, and students are there. But it's always the smallest things. If you have a meeting, will there be any tea? Because it's just a courtesy that if you would invite people to talk about a project, that you'd offer them a cup of tea. And those are the things. So we, lest anybody go out of here with a misapprehension, we don't have a huge budget, but we have the kind of a budget that makes those things possible. When our students go to places, we have a budget that pays for their bus fares. When asylum seekers come in for their graduation, we have a budget that pays for their certificates and a little refreshment. And those things, they're important for people on all sides of the project to understand that that project is worthwhile. Because as an academic staff member, the number of times you felt, oh, I better go and get a box of chocolates to say thank you, or I better... You know, you can do that for so many years, and then you think, does the university really want me to do this? You know, it's not that you begrudge your €5 for whatever it is, but if you're constantly doing it, you do wonder, is it just me, or is this a university thing? And what we've done is we've made that a university thing. There is a budget where, for those sort of small things that just make this kind of work so much easier, to be able to provide the bus fare for people either to come in or for our students to go out, to provide the funding for a small reception, to provide a place that you can have a cup of tea with your clients or with your community. Those are the things that actually indicate, yes, the university does want to do this, and we are interested in doing this. And those, I think, make it doable in some ways. You had something to know?
I was just going to add to that, if you don't mind. Just Limerick is so small that it's very easy to make connections. So people, everybody kind of knows each other. So you can, I think you asked the question. So like some of the practicums that the international practicum, which a lot of the students are doing today. So I think that they started off, how many groups did you have last year, Bernie? Like, you grew, like, obviously, community groups. And this year? 15. So it kind of, they do speak to each other, and it does grow. But the community partners are actually doing a session tomorrow, and I think you'd probably get a lot of those kind of the nitty-gritty questions, I think, that you're looking for in setting them up, probably tomorrow. But it is collaborative. So it's the community partners telling the university what their needs are, and it's the university kind of responding to that. So it's not the university going in for their own needs, using the community partners. So it's not like that at all.
No.
So I think that a lot of the teething problems are kind of ironed out earlier on, and there's open dialogue, and that both kind of parties, including the students, the three main elements, know what their roles are.
And talking to a couple of the students upstairs, they talked about what they did this semester, but then recommendations that they had for the next group of students who are coming in next semester, because they're already thinking about, they're already invested, and they want the project to continue, so they're already thinking about things that they want to pass on to the next group.
Yeah. So just
Oh, yes.
on that point, I agree with the idea that it's really important that universities aren't using the stakeholders. And I think with service learning, it's two parts. The service, the university has to be of service, and so it's providing the stakeholder with something that's very important. And secondly, there has to be learning, so the students have to be learning as well. But then there are so many spin-offs from that. So even, for example, and this didn't happen, but there was no reason why it couldn't have, is that with the project we were involved in, debts in custody, there was no reason why we couldn't have tried to elevate that up and looked for some sort of European grant then to go on about debts in custody in European prisons. And the advantage would have been, now we have the Irish Prison Service and the Inspector of Prisons on board with us already, because we've developed that relationship. So, there's so many ancillary benefits that kind of come out of those kind of service learning projects that aren't even envisaged. And so they're,
Well, I guess the ethics point is really
sorry,
important.
I'll get you.
Yeah, which both Catherine and Shane have mentioned, that it really is our responsibility to ensure we're being ethical in the way that we engage in service learning, because it can be very damaging, not to the university necessarily, but actually to the people who are involved in your projects, if we just helicopter in and out. Yeah. And that happens all too frequently from a research perspective. And you see that almost, I think, the point at which I was most disgusted with my profession was in one of the UN camps in Lesbos, where you actually see academics run to the boats to be the first person to capture a refugee or an asylum seeker who has made that journey, to be the first person who can publish that experience with no regard at all for the human that has just lived through that torture and that pain. And I think that is something, particularly at the University of Limerick, but in all the universities in Ireland, that we're very conscious of that, because the Irish, I guess, also have a really strong experience of migration and a really strong experience of the negativity associated with migration. If you think of, the no blacks, no Irish, no dogs in the UK up until the latter part of the previous century, that we're very familiar with that. So I think most academics in Ireland come at these types of service and community learning from a real sense of wanting to do more. We realise our profession is privileged, so it is our responsibility to be socially responsible and to teach our students to be socially responsible, and you do that through Engage.
I see there's a question here, but I must give credit because I know there are people in the audience from the other universities. All together in all of the Irish universities and higher education institutions, we've all been working towards this best practice, and it is a very strong consensus that works across Irish higher education. So in that respect, we really can't claim to be unique. We're very proud to be part of that collaborative effort. But you had a question.
Yeah, I'm interested in kind of another side of what you're talking about. I was really interested in the discussion that you were having about kind of pushing students to have uncomfortable conversations as an opportunity for kind of deeper learning. And I was wondering if you could share any other best practices that you might have noticed in terms of fostering like self-reflexivity and authentic reflection in your students?
So to take the pressure off the two here, so part of the setup with the practicum, I mean, a strong core principle is reflexive thinking and reflecting. So I know all of Bernie's students, they carry out a diary, a learning journal. I think mine do, yours do. Yeah. So it would be one of our core sort of teaching principles that they have to be thinking about what they're doing. And actually, it's very hard to get students to think about what you're doing if you give them a 50-minute lecture. And, but when you stick them in a situation that is quite different to the one they were expecting, or is just an unusual, it's not their norm, they can't help but sort of have a response. And so many times all we're doing is capturing that response. We're giving them the tools to capture that response because something happens, they're amazed, they have some sort of an insight. But actually that happens pretty much every time they go out and they meet people. So we give them the tools that they can record that. And it's quite interesting at the end of the semester to see, as they look on their own sort of progression, the things they've learned and the things that they were thinking at the start towards the end. So in many ways, when you have the setup, that kind of deep learning or reflexive learning or immersive learning, we have all sorts of different ways of characterizing, that happens organically. What we do, if you like, is scaffold around that so that they're supported. So we're not throwing them, when you said to have disturbing conversations, we're not kind of pushing them to go, it's not that kind of a disruption. But they're there in a situation which may be a little less familiar than a classroom, but they're supported by our collaborations and by our key partners. So whenever we work with the community, we have a partner in the community who's the liaison person, who's the point person, and we have a range of tools to support them. It's really about supporting the spontaneity in many ways that is scaffolded. I don't know if any...
And actually, on that, I think there's two sides to that. So sometimes students found the lack of prescriptive and the structure difficult.
Yeah.
So it's not like in a lecture theatre where one continuous assessment, one end of year exam, here's the 12 weeks of lectures. So now you're told, no, you have to produce, we're producing a report here, you're working on this jurisdiction. So much is left to them to do. So many complained about that.
Yeah.
But equally then, the flip side of that was the benefits that it gave them at the end. And so just some of the comments that we've taken down here that I have, you have students, they're coded, but you just automatically found yourself going into a lot more detail and a lot more depth. Was one student, if this was just an essay, I would throw down anything, but I actually wanted to do this properly. Every sentence had to be accurate and had to make sense, so it was definitely important. But then one student, I thought this was interesting, the fact that other people are depending on you, be it the team or the stakeholder, you're always going to be trying that bit harder. You're taking greater care in what you're saying, whereas in an essay it's more like an opinion or something, and it is not actually important. Whereas they could see, because you had a stakeholder involved, that importance was much more immediate, and it was more immediately apparent to them. And that's the ownership thing that we were talking about earlier as well. So, yeah, with the unstructuredness, it does cause difficulty. And it does, I'm sure, with international education, when you're acclimatizing and so on, that is a difficulty, picking up cultural nuance and so on. But that's where the strength is as well. But you have to work through it.
I was going to say, we obviously won't name the student, but Eric, the guardian angel here behind, there was a student sent out, had grave reservations and was emailing back home, I don't think I want to do this, I think I've changed my mind, I don't think... And there's that sort of, that is a fairly typical sort of panic when you're put into a real life context, but it's a good learning situation. And this is where we talk about the scaffold, because Eric was at one side saying, no, you're okay, I've spoken to them in Limerick, you're going to be okay. And I was at the other side, and I was prepped, I understood. And this particular student then went on, of course, to have a wonderful experience. Now has a much different perspective on. And I think overcoming those sorts, being in a situation where you do feel slightly challenged, and then overcoming it is the best learning experience of all, because then you can learn that you can meet a challenge and you can overcome it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I think it throws up more questions about the traditional style of teaching than anything else.
It does, yeah.
I mean, really, it does. You know, I don't know what it's like in Europe and America, but in Ireland, it's very much by rote.
Yeah.
And the students come in, and a lot of them now go to kind of special schools to get the results to get into college. A grind school, they call it. They're there for like 10 hours a day for 7 days a week for 2 years, and they come in here, and unless it follows that pattern, they don't know what to do. So they're not coming out of the second level knowing how to learn independently or how to cope independently, because there's so much helicoptering and snow ploughing going on.
Yeah.
There are lots of these opportunities, not only for your students, but for our students, are really fantastic for transitioning them from childhood into adulthood and from a protected, cosseted, privileged environment into the real world. Sorry, Eric.
I was just going to offer one thing, and it isn't part of the UL practicum, but when thinking about difficult discussions and self-reflection and how to kind of push students towards that, one thing that we offer our students when they go abroad for a full semester is it's a one-credit online module that we offer to students, and it's a series of 5 assignments over the course of the semester. I'm actually teaching a module of it this semester, and one of the goals of that module is to get students thinking about what are some of the challenging conversations that you had that you weren't expecting. What are some of the goals, expectations that you had for your host culture, and what are the realities, and how are they different? Because students are so busy when they get here. They're traveling, they're in class, they're meeting people. They don't take time to just step back and to think about the experience. And that's one of the goals of the module, is to get them thinking about whether it's a challenging conversation they had, or whether it's a cultural, or whether it's a personal challenge they're going through. I'm not sure I'm ready for what I signed up for. It gets them kind of working through some of that and thinking about that in ways that they likely aren't otherwise.
Can I just add is that perhaps the people we've left out of the conversation is actually the learning for us as the teachers and as the module coordinators. So for me, the most enjoyable module is the Engage module. And that's not because, you get to sit back and you let students to do more of the work, but actually you learn so much about yourself as an educational professional, and it takes you out of all of those comfort zones that I mentioned earlier, and you learn a lot about you as a teacher. You learn a lot about you as a facilitator between the education world and the community world, and you really grow as an educational professional as well, which I think both Shane and Maura would.
Yeah, if you
concur
work with youth workers, you just reinvent your teaching from scratch. You could learn so many things from youth workers. Yeah, I've definitely improved. Sorry.
I just want to ask about the outcomes. The individual stories are compelling, but I know there's an obsession sometimes with measuring outcomes. Are you going to talk about that later, or do you want to talk about it now? Measuring the outcomes for the faculty, for the students, for the partners.
So that's actually one of the Kate this morning, when she was talking about systems performance frameworks, which is how universities are measured. Now measuring engagement is actually from this September forwards is a core component of Irish higher education, across all of Irish higher education, and university funding and higher education funding will be held back if you can't demonstrate outcomes. So we actually have a whole range of indicators for community engaged learning, for community engaged research, for volunteering, and for community work. And We've worked with Irish universities, so Campus Engage is the national body, and some of my colleagues, can't see any in the room, but I know I have colleagues from Dublin, from Maynooth, from Cork, from all of the Irish universities, the DIT and the higher education. We have put forward the kinds of metrics, and we have this, a mantra, no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers. Because you have to be able to show that you're making an impact. And I mean, if you work in a university, you can't work in a university without knowing about, oh, we have to have an impact. And I think in many ways, we underestimate the impact that this kind of teaching and learning can have. So one of the big ways we underestimate it is we think that this is just teaching and learning. But if you take what Shane is talking about, he has the basis now. And I know one of your colleagues, John Lombard, in his department was saying this is a perfect foundation stone for a grant proposal, because now I have partners, now I have a track record, now I've delivered something. I know with John and I, we got money from the Irish Research Council for the work we were doing. We set up an international network. And now we have a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship from the EU Caroline programme. And all of that is on the back of our collaboration with getting our students together. But I often think when you look at university impact, we're inclined to look at the high-level results, you know, the research grants, the publications and the citations. But for any of those kinds of high-level results, you never write a paper or co-author a paper with somebody that you don't get on with, that you don't have a relationship with. You never get money or a successful proposal if you're not working with a collaborator that you can trust, because any kind of a research funding or any kind of project funding has at least 50 million parts to the application, and if you don't have a partner that you can trust can deliver the different boxes. So in many ways, what we do here on a very small scale with UL practicums and with engaged teaching and learning, that's the foundation. That's where the impact and the outcomes and the deliverables begin, because that's where you have a project which is small enough that you can manage, where you can negotiate the relationships, where you can build a relationship, and then when that's working, then you bring somebody else in, then you expand the project, then you maybe go the next step further. And that really has, I think in all of our different projects, you can see a progression from when we started. They typically lead to the next one. So none of us who have been involved in one project have stopped. They've always led to the next thing. And they've always been characterized by both academic outputs as well as research outputs. And in our surveys of student learning and student experiences, experience, yeah.
The UL practicum as well, it's an accredited module, so the students get credit for it, so that has to go through the academic kind of, the APRC or whatever that stands for here, the committee. So there are kind of learning outcomes tied in with the international practicum. So that there is an end to it, so there's a lot of reflection, there's journals, there's point-to-point contact, and there are associated outcomes with it as well.
Sorry, I thought you meant outcomes in terms of project outcomes. Do you mean student?
That was one of the focuses. I mean, for example, when you're talking about the resourcefulness that students seem to acquire, I mean, how do you measure that they're more resourceful than other students who are just taking the traditional?
So I just worked with 10 students, but what I did then was I linked it back to the international literature on service learning, capstone modules and so on. And so it confirmed what was coming out of those studies, that in terms of skills or pedagogy or and then, you know, ancillary outcomes as well around employability and so on. So that's all I can say for you, is that I was working with a small group of students, but published the findings in the International Journal of Criminal Justice Education, but linked it back with international literature. And I do think that these practicums, these advanced learning projects, the outcomes are tangible and are confirmed by the international literature.
I also, sorry.
I wanted to add to that in terms of measurable outcomes. On the student side, it's not something that we're doing with our students here in Limerick this semester, but at one of our other sites this semester, we are currently working with about 60 different students to measure outcomes on the IDI. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's a cross-cultural competency scale. And so we're looking at what different aspects of the experience abroad what impact it has on their progression on the IDI. So we're looking at students who live with host families. We're looking at students who are involved with community engagement projects. We're looking at students who are participating in that online class that we offer to see which of those experiences has the biggest impact or any impact on students' progression through the IDI and their student development over the course of a semester. So I don't have any answers for you right now, but in a few months after the data's come in and we have the student scores, we'll know at least that bit.
We're strongly interested in that. I think the overall outcomes and the variety of outcomes are really valuable. But as someone in the study broad office, we're trying to sell this opportunity. It's good for us to have measurable, short, easy to explain results that we can say, hey, resourcefulness measured by this metric. Because we've had the experience of trying to measure these outcomes, and they're actually the opposite of what we're expecting. And so it's a factor in the area that we have to.
So I can actually see, as we answer this question, as we all talk, I can see a project emerging already. But on our project, we have a social psychologist. That's the 3-year postdoctoral fellowship. And I love social psychologists because they measure feelings, they measure. So some of the ratings on our research are measuring empowerment, which we can talk about it, but I didn't know you could measure it. But there are ways to do that in social psychology in terms of surveys and so on. And we actually have a 3-year program to measure what is the impact. So when you have students working in groups, and when you have young people, we have time series. How do they feel about a range of issues? Did they feel that they had capacity, capability, voice, agency at the start? Did they feel in the middle and at the end? So we are measuring it as well. And so you see how, again, it leads. You can't actually talk about practical projects like this simply as teaching and learning. They naturally begin to blur the lines between research and so on.
Service as well, yeah.
Thank you so much for your patience and for your attendance today.